In this presentation, I'd like to consider something that I think has been neglected in many of the conversations about environmental footprints of food production systems. Before going much further, I need to emphasize that all too often inaccurate figures are being used in discussions about the impact of animal source food production versus plant source food production. According to the EPA, all of agriculture produces approximately 9% of total US greenhouse gas emissions. You can compare this to 28% for transportation, 28% for electricity, 22% for industry, and 11% for commercial and residential uses. Of that 9% attributed to agriculture, less than half, 4%, comes from animal agriculture. And of that, less than half, little less than 2% of the total comes from beef. And it's important to compare the emissions produced by various activities. So for example, life cycle CO2 equivalent emissions from twice the average US consumption of raw boneless trim beef per day would be less than the tailpipe emissions for driving 2,700 miles per year in a private car or flying in a commercial jet, JFK to LAX, via Denver round trip. Frequently, people will apply global statistics to a particular country. It's important that we realize that those vary tremendously. So, for example, the livestock sector globally is 14.5% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Compare that with 4% of the total for the United States. It's important that we not attribute all of that global livestock emissions to any one animal source food production. In this case, beef cattle globally are 6%, so less than half of the global total. And in the US, our cattle production is responsible for less than 0.5% of that global total. This points to the importance of efficiency in production systems so that we have 8% of the world's beef cattle, but we produce less than 0.5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And then also, if we compare countries or groups of countries, we can see very different trends. So in the United States, the emissions of methane from enteric fermentation, the fermentation that takes place in the rumen of cows, sheep, goats, has remained flat. So let's do that again. And it's important that we recognize that there are very different trends in different countries and groups of countries around the world. If we look at the cattle enteric fermentation per year, so they've been flat in the United States since 1961. In all of the industrialized nations, the trend has been significantly downward since the 70s. In the developing nations, however, we're seeing a dramatic increase. And this is where we should be focusing on deploying the appropriate technologies that have been used in the industrialized nations to lower the enteric fermentation emissions of methane. People have tried to model what would happen if we were to remove animal agriculture from the United States completely. And that means removing the animals, including pets. As with anything, In life, there are going to be costs and there are going to be benefits. On the benefit side, these researchers projected a greenhouse gas emission reduction of 2.6% of the US total, which would amount to less than 0.4% of the global total. But that's going to come with the cost of unbalancing our food ecosystem and the creation of essential dietary nutrient deficiencies. So, with that as background, I'd like to move into a subject that I don't think has received sufficient attention. And I'll start by asking, what is the footprint of diabetes? And yes, I am very uncomfortable with using that phrase with a disease that is the leading cause of non-traumatic amputations in the United States, where every 30 seconds someone in the world loses a lower leg due to diabetes. But nevertheless, I think it's a fair question to ask. What is the environmental cost of chronic disease and the healthcare system that is charged with treating it? It's been estimated that the average American with type 2 diabetes uses pharmaceuticals equal to 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. If their use of those diabetes-specific pharmaceuticals was eliminated, it could result in the reduction of almost 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. It's hard to relate to a figure like 50 million metric tons. So what's that equivalent to? Well, using these figures and these sources, it's equivalent to the carbon sequestered by more than 65 million acres of forests in 1 year. That's an area of forest that would be the 9th largest state in the United States, between Colorado and Oregon. It would be the 76th largest country in land area, larger than the United Kingdom. Or it's the equivalent to the emissions from roughly 275,000 rail cars of coal. That would be a train more than 2,700 miles long, essentially the distance from Philadelphia to Los Angeles. Or it would be equivalent to the emissions produced by consuming more than 115 million barrels of oil, which would be more than 57 supertanker loads per year. And that would be the energy equivalent of more than 1,700 days output of all the solar panels and wind turbines in the United States. Or that's equivalent to the emissions produced by more than 10.8 million passenger cars driven for 1 year. That's 4% of the registered passenger vehicles in the United States. Or that would be equivalent to more than 5.7 million homes' energy use for 1 year. Or that's equivalent to the emissions avoided by replacing 1.9 billion incandescent bulbs with LED bulbs. Or that's equivalent to the emissions avoided by almost 10,800 wind turbines running for a year. If the average American diabetic could eliminate their medication use, they would reduce their CO2 equivalent or carbon footprint 29% more than if they switched from a high meat to a vegan diet. And when we look at the chronic diseases and the leading causes of death in the United States, and we look at it from the perspective of hyperinsulinemia playing at least an aggravating role, if not a causal role, in these diseases, we begin to ask just how much larger must these numbers be? Because I was only talking about pharmaceutical costs from diabetes. The healthcare system has a significant greenhouse gas footprint. Now, 2%, 4%, 10%, these numbers aren't nothing, they're important. But when we have a conversation, we need to be looking across the entire spectrum from production through the health of the consumer. Because after all, food is produced to nourish and support the population. I think it's past time for us to be doing better life cycle analyses on this aspect, as well as the work that's being done in sustainable beef production, for example. And most important, it's critical for individuals to recognize that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. In fact, this may be the most practical and the most impactful thing that we as individuals can do. And we certainly are worth it. Thank you for listening.